I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of the Top 10 of the 2010s, a new series that I've been doing now on its second wave of a different genre. That, of course, is the romance genre. But if you're new to the series, because you most likely are, what I do every single week is I break down my favorite movies of the decade. But I decide them and divide them by the genre. So we start off by doing my top 10 of the decade every 3 weeks. So we start with the first video being honorable mentions and my 10 to 7 picks, with the next week being 6 to 2 picks, and then the final episode being the sole dedication of my favorite action movie of the decade, or this in a couple weeks is going to be my favorite romance movie of the decade. So stay tuned every week so you never miss a video. Subscribe to the channel so you get to see some of my favorite movies of the decade divided by genre, and romance is actually maybe my favorite genre. I decided to do romance in general because if I were to do rom-coms that would be maybe too specific, but then romance can mean a lot of things, so we wanted to really narrow down what it means in terms of the qualifications, and that of course is my show, so I made those qualifications. And essentially what I decided to do is that the romance could be a romantic comedy because that's a central element of the film. The romance is a central element, but there's certain types of romances which are kind of only adjacent to the film that didn't count. So for the most part I was looking for romances that are between two people of a consenting age, or which romance was a central point of the film. So some things that didn't make the list, the bromance, so something like a 21 Jump Street didn't make that list. Something like child romances, so Moonrise Kingdom or Submarine didn't make that, even though they are sort of romance films, but they're something else as well. And then I even cut it off to the period romance, so no Little Women, no Anna Karenina, even though those two maybe wouldn't have made the list, because yes, romance is so much involved, but so is sort of the giant ensemble, and the period piece in a way is almost the exciting part about the movie, and then there's other characters who have other sort of arcs and storylines. So for the most part, this is sort of a two-person romance. Can be a romantic comedy, can also just be just regular romance. Like I said, though, it is one of my favorite genres, so there was really a hard list to make, and if I kept it so broad then I wouldn't be able to choose, essentially. But of course, this is the honorable mentions video, probably the biggest episode we're going to have every week, every genre, because we're going to be talking about 5 honorable mentions. I always keep it to 5 honorable mentions, and then of course my 10 to 7 picks. Starting off with my first honorable mention, which is a little bit of a cheat, but I'm going to do it because it's my show, which is Amour and 45 Years. Now these both represent the elderly romance of my picks. Both shot in a similar way with these static cameras, and both, of course, trying to reflect what love means, especially after 45 years of marriage or near the end of your life. With Amour, directed by Michael Haneke, he brings in almost a cynical kind of pessimism to the fact that you love someone, but then you ultimately have to watch them go suffer and struggle through the rest part of their life. And what does that mean? And what does love mean at that age? And what's your commitment to the other person? And how you have to you almost final step of totally committing yourself to this life. And it's a bleak movie. It's emotionally raw in a lot of ways, which is why I was so sort of stunned by the movie. But it is still shot often in wide, long takes. It's a painful movie to get through, but an interesting one, a heartbreaking one, and a really unique sort of representation I wanted on this list of elderly romance. So literally, Amour, what does love mean at this older age? And then 45 Years, about how a great relationship until an event happens, and then that whole movie is just one long reflection of what happens, and the reflection of how this changes your life and how this impacts your past versus your future, which I think both films do, reflecting on the past but also looking towards the future, that inevitable that you almost have to look forward to once you get older. And then of course how those impacts your friends and family and how they sort of move forward. Your friends in the case of 45 Years, and then Family in the case of Amour. Two really great films. Slow, kind of painful movies to get through. They're not these quick, fast-paced movies. They're both heartbreaking, but they're both sort of intellectually challenging and emotionally raw and interesting. And they both sort of have stuck with me. 45 Years maybe a little bit more just because of that central question is so unique and so interesting. But I think maybe the filmmaking of Amour is a little bit concentrated, but both still great movies that are very intellectually challenging, intellectually interesting, but also emotionally interesting as well. It has sort of that both intelligence, which I appreciated and wanted to put on that list. Then we have A Star Is Born, and this will always sort of stay in the bubble in a lot of these lists. For the same reason why I didn't make my top 10 of the 2018 list was because even though I love certain moments of this movie, certain movies are cinematic bliss. Certain parts of this movie are some of my favorite moments of the year. But despite that, some of the other moments of the movie I actively dislike. So it's a sort of mixed movie overall. Now, for someone who still watches a bunch of movies a year, oftentimes I'll appreciate the ambitious, maybe sloppy, but movies with really great singular moments versus just a generic, say, thriller or comedy. Of course, my favorite movies are ones that are able to do both, that are sort of perfectly paced and structured and have this great sort of structure as a whole. And every moment is brilliant, and that's my favorite movies, of course. But still, I appreciate these movies that have these really great moments because there's a lot of things in A Star Is Born that has stuck with me. Just like, the obvious being the shallow moment, which I think is one of these unique cinematic moments where it's a mix of a story moment climax, of music, and of visuals that only the medium of cinema really allows to create this overwhelming emotional feeling that I get when we cut to the desert for the first time in Lawrence of Arabia, with the ending of The Godfather, when we hear that sort of score, that key score, even the ending of something like Miller's Crossing. There's these certain moments of music, of blend of music and images and storytelling that climax into just a brilliant moment. And I think Shallow is of that ilk, despite me not initially enjoying the other moments. But this is a positive show, so I want to talk about the positives, of course. Now, I also really appreciated the ending, for example, the sort of brilliant cinematography by Matthew Libatique, often do these sort of close-ups in the shallow moment, or even the meet cute of these Cassavetes-esque sort of realistic, grounded cinematography, but also with a sort of gleam and a love between the actors. And speaking of that love, Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper have an incredible relationship and a chemistry throughout the film that you totally buy. And then Bradley Cooper really has a sort of a Sam Elliott-esque transformation, really transforms into this character of Jackson Bane, and does a great job, of course, directing the film. So overall, I had to mention, just because I love certain moments of this film, and it's just a really beautiful romance, and the ending is just maybe one of the best endings of all these movies. It's so pitch perfect, and I've seen the ending so many times, but problem it not making the list is just because of these certain pitfalls that it has that I just personally dislike and make me almost fast forward through them. So I couldn't really put a movie on a list that I actually have to fast forward through, but that's just a personal opinion. Star Is Born is still a great recommend, and a lot of people, of course, love it, so it had to make the honorable mentions at least. My next pick is Plus One. This is a movie that was totally underseen, came out last year, but it's a really great romantic comedy. It's formulaic, yes, but it is a perfect formulation of that. It is the perfect formula. And that is because of its reliance on its great idea, this idea that there are these two there's a moment in your 20s where you often have to go to a bunch of weddings because all your friends are getting married. So there's like a 2-year period where every summer you're going to a wedding every weekend. And of course the plot of the movie is that these two friends decide to be each other's dates to all these weddings and try to get each other dates. Of course, I think you know where this is going to go, but the formula works, but also it has that great structure, that great plot, and that great sort of setup. And then the other element is the chemistry between the two leads and the charisma between the two leads. And the real standout for me, which was almost my winner of the Best Actress last year, was Maya Erskine from Plus One. She is brilliant in this movie. One of the best comedic female performances of the decade, one of the best comedic performances of the decade. I liken her to someone like Kristen Wiig's in 2011's Bridesmaids. Maybe because of the wedding comparison, but she is sort of overtly sarcastic, but then later on in the film, definitely vulnerable and really raw and honest once you get to know her, and that sort of sarcasm was used as sort of almost humor as a defense mechanism, as a barrier, but then eventually we get to see more of her and her true self, and you fall even more in love sort of with her. And what Maya Erskine does in terms of just her unique line readings or her incredible physical humor and the way she just moves her body around, especially when she's drunk, it's just hilarious. It's definitely one of the best comedic performances of last year, and one of the best comedic performances, like I said, of the decade. decade. And, of course, we didn't talk about Jack Quaid, who is also sort of a great lead and maybe relatable in the sense of the hesitant, unsure of himself, over an analytical guy, as an equally stable lead. But in my opinion, this is the Maya Erskine show, and she's a total standout. And it's just a movie that you watch and you totally enjoy, and it's the great rom-com formula, but Maya Erskine is the total standout for me, and it's a movie that I've seen and definitely holds up on rewatches as well. Then my next pick is going to be Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Now, this is a movie I just saw, so I didn't want to almost put it on my list just because of fear of recency bias, or I don't know how long it's going to stay with me or if I'm going to rewatch it. But I saw it in the theater and was definitely impressed by the movie. I'm glad I saw it in the theater, and I recommend you see it in the theater as well, because I found it to be actually a really challenging film. It lacks the sort of traditional, I guess, movie vocabulary of either fast-paced editing or over-explanation of exposition of storytelling, or of music to sort of propel the film. It is barren in a lot of ways. It is slow. It takes its time. But of course, by the end of the movie, it's incredibly emotionally rewarding. And I wouldn't sort of necessarily put it against that film, but it is something to remind yourself that it is, I find challenging, just in terms of getting into the movie at the first. But once you get into the relationships, it's incredibly engrossing. And this is maybe, I would say, one of the most erotic or just sensual movies on this list. Often the movie is sparse with dialogue and is obsessed with just using cinema for looks, for glances, for touching and sort of feeling and sensual aspects of cinema, and building and understanding that relationship through attraction, through looks, and just through the facial expressions by the breakout actors, for me at least, Adele Haenel and Noémie Merlant, two actresses who I haven't seen before but are very impressed by, and both sort of equally, in both my mind, are incredible. And because Noémie's character is a painter, as she is sort of reflecting what she thinks of Adele's character, what she looks like, she has to go back and paint it. We are also, as an audience member, thinking about these small little gestures and things she makes, because we are in the position of Noémie as the painter, to analyze and try to figure out what Adele, her smile's like, and then how she sort of places her hand. And I talked about sensual. It's almost an ASMR in terms of the sound design. There is a lack of music, so just the painting and the walking of the footsteps, there has sort of an ASMR real feeling to it, I've noticed. And then the framing of the movie in general is this beautiful, what Celine Sciamma does, very painterly, of course, which is apropos. But there's some really just stunning images of Adele on the beach, or there's a shot of Noémie in a wide in front of the fireplace, but then of course really beautiful close-ups as well. Just sort of really interesting. Of course, the fireplace scene, of course, the very ending of the film, the slow push-in. Just great directorial choices and framing that have some of the best I've seen, have some of the best on this list. And I talked about the dialogue, which is sparse, but when it is there, it's poetic and really beautiful, and a great use of it, and every word definitely is meaningful, and every line is really novel-esque or poetic. It's really just a total directorial achievement, and definitely a great movie, and a totally just beautiful, sensual, romantic movie, and I recommend it to all. Even though it is challenging, you have to refocus. The ending, especially in the reward, is incredibly satisfying. Then my final honorable mention is Sleeping with Other People. This is an underrated sex comedy that came out earlier in the decade, but has sort of gone to the wayside, but has both a little bit of a cult status, and I'm definitely a part of that. The biggest recommendation I guess you can give it to you is, have you seen Russian Doll on Netflix? This is by the co-creator, along with Natasha Lyonne, wrote and directed this movie. And I saw this movie before I saw When Harry Met Sally, and this definitely is a movie that has that sort of When Harry Met Sally romantic comedy formula, because once I saw When Harry Met Sally, I was like, oh, this is just Sleeping with Other People. It is maybe the funniest romantic comedy on my list, thanks to the comedic talents of Jason Sudeikis and Alison Brie. I actually think their chemistry, out of all the people on this list, may be the highest. They're both charismatic and have that sort of great setup of, they used to sleep with each other, find a relationship without sex, and it really, it seems, in my opinion, like a modern, almost millennial romance, because it introduces sex as a really central part of the romantic equation, which it hadn't in something like When Harry Met Sally, and really explores that, and that them, of course, to being sex addicts, now trying to go without sex and see what the relationship is afterwards, is incredibly funny. Some of the funniest moments in terms of sex comedy of the decade. The two leads have the incredible chemistry together. Alison Brie is so charming. Jason Sudeikis is masculine and sort of that right amount of jerk energy that is charming. And the two are just so great together. I wish I could see more of them together into something else, but Sleeping with Other People, check it out as just maybe the funniest romantic comedy. It works with that great structure and really explores sex as a unique element of a relationship. Okay, now going to my list. My number 10 pick is Begin Again.
A guy like that falls on his luck for a couple of years. People lose sight of who he is.
This really is a bit of a long shot, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's when the magic happens.
Waiting for the next move.
A musical romance from the musical master John Carney, the director of Once and Sing Street, and this brings us another romantic movie about the sort of romance of music and how that introduces and intertwines within the movie. And what I love about it is that it is so unabashedly romantic. Mark Ruffalo plays a midlife crisis record producer, and Keira Knightley plays a recently broken up with underground musician, we'll say, a striving, struggling musician, and Mark Ruffalo finds her in a bar, and they sort of use each other to get over previous relationships, over sort of ruts in their life, to find new love and new romance. And this is sort of an abstract pick in the sense that it's about relationships and it's about love in a lot of ways, but it's about love and passion of music and getting over relationships and working together as sort of a platonic relationship to help each other's relationship. And that's what I like about it. It doesn't fall into this trap of Mark Ruffalo being, 20 years older than Keira Knightley and being this sort of odd Hollywood trying to make it more similar romance, which just doesn't work. It's not that. It is about mentorship in a lot of ways, or friendship, and then using that to get over your past and look towards the future. It is a totally optimistic movie about love, and that's what I kind of love about it. It has these great musical moments of recording in the streets of New York, or of the headphone jack splitter, which is just a great idea that I've always sort of come back to. It's just a total great date movie that I would recommend to everyone because it's so unabashedly romantic, and because it uses the medium of music in a really unique way, of those recording scenes of it as sort of a central theme, of life, of music, of love. And I think this movie is a representation, at least on my list, of the idealized romance, that is not trying to show romance as it is maybe in real life, of how perfect everything is, of how imperfect everything is. Everything in this movie, in a lot of ways, is kind of perfect. It uses music and it uses the cinematic medium to show the idealized, in my ways, the idealized version of music, of making your dreams, of the city life, of relationships. It is, so many people criticize this fantasized ideal, but I think this movie sort of embraces this fantasized ideal that if you look at a Nancy Meyers movie, you have these sort of idealized kitchens, or in When Harry Met Sally, I think you have this idealized version of everyone being perfectly in fashion, and I think this one is a perfect ideal of music and how that plays an important role in a relationship, especially this relationship of people who love music and musicians themselves. So it's maybe the movie that will make you feel just the best walking out of it on my list, and just a pure joy of a movie. It is fantasized, it's idealistic, it's not meant to be romantic, but it uses sort of the energy and the romanticism of music and of city life and past relationships and of platonic friendship to create something really beautiful, and something that just totally blew me away, and it was just I found so heartwarming. Then my 9th pick is Set It Up.
Save yourself. We're full-on parent trapping.
No, we're not.
Okay, I think I've seen the Lindsay Lohan classic enough times to know that we're full-on parent trapping hard.
All I care about is that I'm not still an assistant when I'm 28.
I'm 28.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. For you. That's very sad for you.
This is a great lost in your 20s movie that, like Sleeping with Other People, in a different way, captures the sort of millennial, we'll say, today's modern romance, especially, the idea of being 20 living in a city with a bunch of roommates and just trying to make it in your respective careers. The structure is also great because you have these two assistants that are meeting each other, that are trying to get their bosses to hook up so that they can have more time to themselves. It's just a great setup. And then, of course, like I said, mentioned before, romance and romantic comedy, so much has to do with the chemistry between the two leads and, of course, the charisma of the two leads. And this one has the incredible amount of charisma with, I think maybe the two most charismatic movie stars upcoming now, with Glenn Powell, who plays this sort of sarcastic but traditionally masculine version of a platonic ideal, in the sense that he's a guy that guys want to be but girls like. Then, of course, Zoe Deutch as this bubbly, lighthearted, still independent woman who has a plan but not necessarily doesn't realize her lack of action in getting that plan. But what I also think it explores, which is something that other romantic comedies like What If explore, which is the idea of career versus romance, and how now that we're living in this modern age of dual income households and everyone's striving, there have to be someone in the relationship has to make sacrifices for either another person's career or their own career, and that sort of struggle between, do you want a family, or do you want to be really successful in your career? Because sometimes you have to choose in certain situations, and that's a really integral part that I think Set Up totally explores, because as their assistants to their job, they realize, is this the path to getting to the top? Do I really want to be like these people, even though I see the destructiveness of their lives, that I have to, I'm trying to get out of this life, but yet I'm still in the path to this life? Is me being put in this position actually hindering my creative aspirations and my goals and giving me an excuse not to do certain things? It really brings that sort of interesting question of the movie that I appreciated. And then, of course, I think it represents the Netflix rom-com, whether it be To All the Boys I Loved Before You or Always Be My Maybe, which didn't make this list. This was sort of the representation of the Netflix movie, and my favorite of all those Netflix romantic comedies. In the 90s and the 2000s, the romantic comedy was movie theater, movie star driven led. But now that, as the movie stars, box office potential dissipated, ultimately now there's sort of a missing hole where we didn't get a lot of those romantic comedies, at least released in theaters. So Netflix steps in and finds this niche of sort of the young teen / young adult romantic comedy that really have had success in that and works well on their platform. And I think Set Up is sort of representation of that. It's a great modern millennial romance that is so funny. Written by one of the great upcoming comedy screenwriters, Katie Silverman, who also did Booksmart. Two charismatic leads. You can watch it on Netflix. It's a great time, and some really just beautiful moments as well. With the pizza scene, it's something that is maybe, I'd say, my favorite romantic comedy of the decade. My number 8 pick is Loving.
You think you'll lose?
We may lose the small battles, but win the big war.
Is there anything you'd like me to say to the Supreme Court Justices of the United States?
Yeah. Tell the judge I love my wife.
Now, Loving seems to be maybe a little bit forgotten in the past few years because it was seen as, and sort of got lumped into the Oscar movie homework sort of prestige things where, oh, this was in the Oscar buzz, I guess I have to see it. It ultimately got one nomination for Ruth Negga for Best Lead Actress. But I think that's kind of unfortunate that it's got lumped into that because it's different and it's unique, and Jeff Nichols hasn't made a movie since then. But I'm sure he's going to come up with something soon. And why I say it's not like sort of that traditional boring Oscar movie homework genre is because it is a romance that is sparse. It is not something that, if you were thinking about traditional generic Hollywood prestige romance that maybe fails, would be sort of grandiose and epic and melodramatic, but maybe sort of phony and unrealistic. Loving is kind of the opposite of that. It is incredibly sparse, similar to Portrait of a Lady on Fire, where it's about glances, it's about looks, it's about gestures, and what love is on a really basic, almost primal sense. Of course, the story is about Richard and Mildred Loving, a seminal couple in the Loving versus Virginia case, which was about the fight for interracial interracial marriage being legalized, which it wasn't in certain states at the time in the 60s, which eventually went to the Supreme Court and now is legalized, of course. And this could easily have been a U.S. court thriller with two movie stars in the lead, and they're passionate and they're fighters, but that wasn't the Lovings. The Lovings were a simple Virginian couple. They just loved each other, and that's sort of the power of the movie and the power of the story, is that they weren't someone who really fought for their right. You know, it does drive the story in the sense that they're split up together and they have to sort of fight for their love, but they're not ones that are going to make these large speeches or whatever, because it takes it from an almost pure Jonathan Demme-esque humanist perspective that I think Jeff Nichols has, which is the simplicity of they love each other, and you will see it through these small gestures and glances and looks and them spending time together. And of course, Joel Edgerton, Ruth Negga really portraying that in the film, versus the traditional begin again grandiose gestures of love that we see in Hollywood movies. This is not that. This is the realistic version of that, and even the sort of quiet, dimmed down version of that. And that's what the movie is so special, and why I've thought about it and I've revisited it, is because Nichols is able to create these cinematic moments using the cinematic medium to really understand, through the performances, of course, of Ruth Negga and Joel Edgerton, the feeling of love, their sort of really relationship. And the movie isn't this sort of U.S. court thriller. It's about the relationship and their build up together and them falling in love. And we see that all through, no, not dialogue, we're not explaining to it, we see it through their looks, through their gestures, through the pace of the film, which is slow and deliberate and beautiful in the sort of rural countryside of the U.S. It's just one of the most beautiful movies just to look at, to appreciate, and just to fall in love with. And I think that's the best testament for a romance movie, in my opinion. Then my number 7 pick is Blue Valentine.
You always stay the sweetest rose and crush it until the petals fall. You always bring the kindest heart, and with a hasty word you can.
You're actually good.
Recall.
Romance isn't always swooning. It doesn't always have a happy ending, and Blue Valentine is sort of the representation of that on my list. One of the most heartbreaking movies of the decade. Maybe the most heartbreaking movie of the decade, about a relationship that is crumbling, about two people that are stuck together through previous actions, through the beginning love of the relationship to the final end and sort of distraught ending of the relationship. It's a heartbreaking film because we don't just see the end of the relationship. We don't just see the end of why they don't like each other anymore. We see the beginnings of what's going to be a long, decade-long journey of this relationship and the crumbling, dissolve of this relationship. And they, like any other couple, have struggles and fights, but this one just keeps going on and on and on. So what's brilliant about the movie, what Derek Cianfrancis does, is use flashbacks to sort of alternate between the sort of happy parts of their relationship, the early parts, to the sort of destructive later parts of the relationship. And we see even sometimes these small inklings of it in the early parts of the relationship, of the sort of self-childless, which is childlessness of Ryan Gosling's character, which is charming, but then later on is a little bit more self-destructive, and versus Michelle Williams' character, Cindy, who is just trying to find sort of a future for herself while balancing her relationship and then eventually becoming a mom and struggling with that and trying to live her life while still trying to be a great mom to her child, which is why the movie works. When we go flashback and we see the early relationship and we see like the You and Me ukulele dance scene, it's so charming and beautiful and sweet. And then when we see the heartbreaking scenes of them fighting and yelling at each other, it makes it even so more impactful. And then by the time the ending comes around and we see the pictures of them and their great and the relationship when they were happy together, it's just an emotionally exhausting movie, and it has that because of that unique structure, because we can go back and forth. It allows us to understand and comprehend the relationship, which makes the impact of the emotions even stronger. It's a delicate, pitch-perfect storytelling structure, and pacing that Garcia and Friends is able to do. It's a heartbreaking movie. The performances between Michelle Williams and Ryan Gosling are some of their best in a complex, vulnerable, emotional study. It's a movie that has stuck with me, even though I've only seen it once. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that a lot of times we place so much emphasis on the rewatch that, oh, it's really rewatchable. You know, some of my favorite movies of all time, something like Requiem for a Dream, is a movie that has stuck with me, and I have those images burned into my head, even though I've only seen it once, and I'm never going to see that movie again. Similar thing to Blue Valentine. It's heartbreaking, it's crucial, but there's certain moments and there's reasons why I really love this movie, even though I've only seen it once. And I think sometimes we place a little bit too much of an emphasis on movies that we rewatch and we like to come back to, because sometimes movies aren't designed to do that. They're supposed to. This movie, I don't think, was designed to be rewatched all the time. But it is sort of that element of sometimes some people listen to sad music when they're sad, and I think some people watch sad movies when they're sad, and that helps them get out of it. And I think Blue Valentine kind of works for that. So for all those reasons, it's just a totally beautiful, romantic, yes, but sort of the destructive version of romance, which is an important representation I want to have on my list, and a movie that I definitely really just totally respect, and was emotionally distraught and empty when I saw this movie. So those are my picks for the honorable mentions and 10 to 7 movies, romantic movies of the decade. Stay tuned to next week, where I'm going to give my picks from 6 to 2, and then the week after that, a full video on my favorite romantic movie of the decade, which is maybe my favorite movie of the decade. So subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a video, and please comment below. I create this YouTube channel to have comments and to build a great film community. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of your favorite romantic movies of the decade. That's what it, guys. Until next time, stay tuned.